We continue our series on the life of Christ from a Jewish perspective. We are still in the fourth main division, which we're going to complete today, and that is on his death. And if you have the outlines with you, you can turn to page 50. We now come to capital D, which is the accompanying signs. And these accompanying signs will make up the 26th stage of the series that we're doing on his death. Now, at the moment of his death, several things happen in Matthew verses 51 through 53. Number one, a great earthquake hits. Secondly, many tombs, not graves, but tombs, are opened. And then thirdly, many believers are resurrected at the moment of his death. Now, the way the text reads, if you have the outline with you and you have the translation correct, the way it reads is that the resurrection takes place the moment Jesus died. But they do not come out of the tombs until his own resurrection. This might help to explain why only those in tombs and not those in graves below the ground are resurrected, because if you have to remain for 3 days, after a few minutes you will suffocate again if you're buried below the ground. But if you're buried in caves, you have room to breathe. And so they resurrected the moment that Christ died, but they stay in the tombs until his resurrection. Then they go into the city of Jerusalem and appear unto many. And after this, they simply are not dealt with again. Now, this is not the resurrection of the Old Testament saints into their mortal state. That would not be possible until after Christ's own resurrection, because he's the first fruits of the immortal resurrection. Rather, this should be understood as previous resurrections in a restoration back to natural life. And what it means to be restored back to natural life is that you will die again later, as was the case with Jairus' daughter and with Lazarus and others. At some point, all of these did die again later. A fourth thing that happens is in Mark's account, verse 38, that says, "And the veil of the temple was rent in twain from top to bottom." Now, this veil was 60 feet long, 30 feet wide, and about 4 inches thick. If somebody ran into a temple for the purpose of tearing it because of its height, they would grab it by the bottom and rip it from the bottom up. But the way it goes here is that the rip began at the top, then worked its way downward, showing it was God who did this. Now, the theological significance of the tearing of the veil is spelled out in the book of Hebrews, especially chapters 9 and 10. The renting of the veil meant that now access to God's presence was available to all. During the entire administration of the law, only one man, of one family, of one clan, of one tribe, of one nation, of one race, of all humanity, ever had access to God's presence, the Jewish high priest, even for him only 1 day out of the year. But now the renting of the veil, free access has been made available to all who believe. Now, Jewish writings from this period do not mention the renting of the veil. Outside the Gospels, there is no other record of it. What we do have in Jewish writings from this period is a whole number of legends. Each one of these legends is somehow connected with the Jewish temple. Each legend is recorded in the same way, dating from the same year, because the rabbis who record the legends after telling us legend is, at the end always state, this and this happened 40 years before the temple was destroyed. The temple was destroyed in the year AD 70. If you subtract 40 years, you come to year AD 30, the very year of this death, this event. Like I said, there are many such stories. Let me just give you 4 quick examples. The first one is recorded by Josephus, and he points out that there was this mysterious extinction of the middle light in the lampstand of the temple. The lampstand had these 7 lights, and the middle one, which was the chief one, began going out inexplicably as of the year 30 AD. A second legend mentioned by both Josephus and the Talmud says that the heavy temple doors that always took several men to swung open on their own accords as of the year AD 70. A third legend says that the lintel of the doorway of the temple cracked and fell that same year. Now, my favorite of all the legends from this period, there are many more, but my favorite one is the legend of Azazel, A-Z-A-Z-E-L. It's a Hebrew word that means removal, but refers to the scapegoat of the 2 goats of the Day of Atonement. On that day, 2 goats were presented before the high priest, and by the casting of lots, 1 goat was chosen to live, and 1 goat was chosen to die. The goat that was chosen to die would be killed by the altar. His blood was taken into the Holy of Holies of the temple and sprinkled upon the mercy seat, which was the lid of the Ark of the Covenant. And then the high priest came out, he went to the live goat, laid his hands upon the head of the live goat, confessed his sins and the sins of Israel, and then the scapegoat was chased away into the wilderness. That's as far as the Mosaic law states. Because of what Isaiah wrote in Isaiah 1:18, though your sins be as scarlet, they shall be white as snow, though they be red like crimson, they shall be as wool. According to the legend of Azazel, it became a tradition that they would tie a red ribbon on the horn of the live goat before it was sent out. And year after year and after year, the red ribbon miraculously always turned white without fail, signifying visibly that God had forgiven the sins of Israel for that year. The legend of Azazel goes on to say that the red ribbon stopped turning white as of 40 years before the temple was destroyed. As of the year AD 70, then, God was no longer forgiving the sins of Israel by means of the 2 goats. What is sad for us who are Jewish believers is this. The rabbis who record these stories fail to conclude the reason. Why did the red ribbon stop turning white? It's because of Tetelestai. It is finished. The final payment has been made. As Hebrews 10:18 says, where the remission of sin is, there is no more a sacrifice for sin. So again, although Jewish writings do not record the actual tearing or renting of the veil, we have enough information in Jewish writings that tell us something significant happened with the temple as of the year 30 AD. And all these rabbinic stories and legends bear witness to that fact. From all these accompanying signs, there are 2 results. The first result in Matthew verse 54 is the faith in the part of a Gentile Roman centurion. The second result in Luke verse 48 is fear among the Jewish leaders as they returned, smiting their breasts, Luke says. Now we move on to the next section in your outline. We come to the burial of Christ, and this will contain stages 27 through 30. And the Gospels we're concerned about here are Matthew 27, verses 57 through 16, Mark 15, 42 to 46, Luke 23, 50 to 54, and John 19, 31 through 42. The 27th stage is in John's account, verses 31 through 37. We have the breaking of the bones and the piercing of Christ. Now verse 31 says, the Jews therefore, because it was the preparation, with a capital P, and all Jewish writings, the day of the preparation always refer to the 6th day of the week. Again, the word the preparation always refer to the 6th day of the week, the Friday. And we'll be making several references to show that the Gospels use very typical terminology for the Friday-Saturday connection, that Jesus really did die on the 6th day of the week. He died on a Friday. The Friday night begins the Sabbath, but the verse goes on to say in verse 37 that that particular Sabbath was a high Sabbath, because whenever the Sabbath falls on a Jewish holy day, like the Passover or some other feast, it renders that day a high Sabbath. In this particular year, the Passover day was from sundown Thursday till sundown Friday. Sundown Friday was the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and the first and seventh day were holy days. So because it was a high Sabbath, they felt it would be not good to have the bodies remain exposed over that particular Sabbath. It goes contrary to Jewish law to have bodies exposed under a normal Sabbath, and in this case it's a high Sabbath, all the more so. So they asked Pilate to hasten death. Last time we discussed the details of how crucifixions were performed. We noted that where the feet were nailed into the cross, there was this little wooden ledge for a specific purpose. And you must remember that when a person dies in crucifixion, he dies not because of loss of blood so much, because of suffocation. The way you're hanging there, you cannot breathe. And so the little ledge was put there so you can raise yourself up, take a breath, and come down again. As long as you had the strength to go up and down that ledge, you could survive for some time. When no food was ever given, you could have all the liquids you could want. And that's why it took sometimes days for a victim to die by crucifixion. Now, one way to hasten death would be to break the legs, and once the legs are broken, they will no longer be able to lift themselves up and take the breath that they need. And so they do break the legs of the other two, but by now, as we already noted, Jesus had dismissed his spirit from his body. And so do not break his legs, but to make sure that he really has died, they throw a spear into his side. And out came blood and water. Both actions fulfilled messianic prophecy. By not breaking his legs, they fulfilled Exodus 12:46, because of the Passover lamb, no bone could be broken. And by piercing him, they also fulfilled Zechariah 12:10, that he would be pierced. Now, the piercing resulted in outpouring of blood and water. There's been some discussion as to what this means medically, and there are opposing views. Some doctors have written saying this is the sign of a ruptured heart, and like to give a nice little picture that Jesus ultimately died of a broken heart. Other doctors have written disputing that very point. So what this means medically, I have no idea whatsoever. But for our concern, the real importance is, what does this mean theologically, not what it means medically. Now, if you have your notes, you'll notice only John records this particular event. And he mentions he was an eyewitness. He saw that spear thrown into his side. Years later, he writes the epistle of 1 John, and in 1 John 5, verses 8 through 12, he gives us a theological, not a medical interpretation. He points out that this was the sign, the blood and the water was the sign that God had provided eternal life, because the evidence that he really did die, and by his death, salvation was provided. The 28th stage is the request for the body of Jesus. Now Mark verse 42 reads, and when even was now come, because there was the preparation, notice again with a capital P, and since Mark's Gentile Roman audience might not know what that Jewish term means, he explains it. That is, the day before the Sabbath. This is typical Jewish terminology for the Friday-Saturday connection. I'm driving this home to get away from that common misconception that he died on a Wednesday or Tuesday or Thursday, a point I'll come back to in a few minutes. But the day was clearly the sixth day of the week. At this point, two men come to Jesus, not to Jesus, but to Pilate, to request the body of Jesus. Two men who up to now had been secret, silent disciples, one of whom we already have met, and that is the man named Nicodemus in John's account, verse 39. But secondly comes Joseph of Arimathea in John's account, verse 38. If we take in all that the Gospels say about Joseph of Arimathea, we learn 9 things about him, or 8 things about him. Number 1, he was of honorable estate. Secondly, he was rich. Thirdly, he was a good man. Fourthly, he was a righteous man. Fifthly, he was looking for the kingdom of God, meaning he was a member of the believing remnant of that day. Sixthly, he was a secret disciple of Jesus up until now. 7, he was a counselor, a member of the Sanhedrin. But 8, he was not there for the purpose of voting against Jesus. And although these two men up to now have been secret disciples, Mark verse 43 says he went boldly unto Pilate asking for the body of Jesus. In contrast to his previous fear and timidity, he was now boldly coming before Pilate, requesting for the body of Jesus. In Mark's account, verse 44 and 45, Pilate sent someone to check if Jesus really is dead. When that has been authenticated, then permission is granted. The 29th stage is in John's account, verse 39 and 40, where the body is removed from the cross, wrapped in linen cloth, and then placed into the tomb. The wrapping of linen cloths, you will notice, is found in John's account, verse 39 and 40, with the verse 40 using the word cloths in plural. The Greek word means strips of cloth, which is the way Jewish bodies were buried. So this is one reason that whatever the Shroud of Turin might be, it is not the Shroud of Christ. The 30th stage is his actual burial in John's account, verse 41 and 42. He's buried in an unused rich man's tomb, the tomb Joseph of Arimathea had actually planned for his own body to be placed in. Normally, if you die a criminal's grave, if you die a criminal's death, you're buried in a criminal's grave. And no doubt a criminal's grave was dug for him. But because of this intervention, he is buried in an unused rich man's tomb. And this fulfills the messianic prophecy, Isaiah 53 verse 9, that says he would be, although they reckon his death with the wicked, he was buried in a rich man's tomb. And they did assign him a criminal's grave, but thanks to his intervention, the prophecy was fulfilled. The death of Jesus marks the second point of the gospel. The first point we discussed last time, and all of its implications. Christ died for our sins. The second point of the gospel, according to 1 Corinthians 15, 1 through 4, is his burial. And so he was buried, which was the evidence of his death. And this also has some theological implications. Let me mention 2. First of all, it marks the end of his humiliation. You find theologians speaking about the humiliation of the Son, which begins with the incarnation, when he took upon himself the likeness of sinful flesh, and then continues all the way to his burial. And it marks the end of his period of humiliation in 2 ways. Number 1, it marks the death of the sinless God-man. So death should not have been true of him, but it was. But secondly, none of those who have been close to him, friends or relatives that have been close to him, were involved with the burial. He's buried by 2 Pharisees who up to now had been secret believers. The second theological significance of the burial is that it marks the beginning of his exaltation. Theologians speak not only of his humiliation, but also of his exaltation. And theologians generally begin the exaltation with his resurrection, culminating 40 days later with his ascension and enthronement at the right hand of God the Father. Personally, I move his exaltation a step earlier with his burial as well. His burial marks not only the end of his humiliation, but also the beginnings of his exaltation, and does so in two ways. First of all, he's buried in a new, unused rich man's tomb, not in a cemetery. And secondly, in place of being buried in a cemetery, he's buried in a privately owned tomb that is found in a garden. Centuries early, in another garden, the first Adam brought sin, death, and judgment. In this garden, the last Adam will bring blessing and new life to come. Luke verse 54 says, "And it was the day of the preparation, and the Sabbath drew on." It was the day of the preparation towards Friday, late afternoon. The Sabbath was drawing on as soon as the sun has set and 3 stars are visible. Now we come to the last section of this part, the sealing of the tomb. In your notes that cover the last 2 stages, 31 and 32. The 31st stage is the preparation for the embalming in Luke's account, verse 55 and 56. And the women take careful note as to where he was actually buried, what tomb he was laid in. In fact, Matthew verse 61 says they sat over against the sepulchre. They sat there against the sepulchre, meditating for a while. They clearly knew exactly which tomb he was placed in. And they also purchased spices because the Sabbath was coming too close to finish all of the embalming procedures, and so they intend to complete the burial procedures the day after the Sabbath. It's very obvious from all these preparations they were not expecting a resurrection to occur. Then comes the 32nd stage, where we have the sealing of the tomb in Matthew chapter 27, verses 62 through 66. The leaders recognized that not only did Jesus prophesy his coming death, he also prophesied his resurrection. And now they are concerned that somebody will remove the body, begin preaching a resurrection, and the last error will be worse than the first. So Pilate does 2 things for them. Number 1, he releases to them a Roman guard to guard the tomb for 3 days. But secondly, he also has the tomb officially sealed with the Roman seal. Now, the way tombs were sealed in those days, that they took a strong rope and placed it around the stone in the door of the tomb. The 2 ends of the rope would then be drawn to the side of the door. And so the ropes were attached to a hook, so to speak, on the wall of the tomb and the side of the stone. And then what the Romans would do is put a wax clay seal. They would place it on the rope where it crisscrossed, and also place it on a part of the stone that also touches the tomb, and so the wax clay with the Roman seal would also be there. And so on 2 sides of the tomb where the stone touched the tomb, there would be a clay seal plus 1 where the ropes crisscrossed. So everything was done in such a way that it would be impossible to roll the stone away without breaking the Roman seal. And to break the Roman seal was punishable by death. And so they've done what they could to keep him from being resurrected. Now, before we move on to the final division of our study, I want to get back to that issue. Exactly when did Jesus die, as far as the day of the week is concerned? The year was 30 AD. What day of the week did he die? And because of Gentile reckoning in time, and because of what he said about 3 days and 3 nights, people have felt he had to be in the tomb for 3 24-hour periods. And so some move his death to a Thursday, more to a Wednesday, and some even to a Tuesday, depending on how they begin the 3 24-hour count-off. But here again, we must interpret the Gospels by Jewish reckoning of time, not by Gentile reckoning of time. And the Jewish reckoning is now required 3 24-hour periods. Now keep in mind, if he was in the tomb for 3 full 24-hour periods and he arose 1 second later, it's already the 4th day, not the 3rd day. Furthermore, if you take in all that Jesus said, he made 3 different statements about the timing of death and resurrection, which from Jewish reckoning, from Gentile reckoning of time, is clearly a contradiction. For example, sometimes Jesus said he would rise on the 3rd day. One example of many is Matthew 16:21. Secondly, he said after 3 days, implying the 4th day. One example of several, Matthew 26:61. And he also said 3 days and 3 nights in Matthew 12:39 and 40. And notice I deliberately gave you all 3 examples from the same gospel to show you it's not a variation between gospel writers, but within the same gospel you have all 3 variations, which on the surface would be contradictory in Gentile reckoning of time, but not in Jewish reckoning of time. In Jewish reckoning of time, part of a year, for example, counts for the whole year. So if a man took the throne on the 12th month of the year, he is viewed as having ruled that whole year. The next month is the 1st month of the new year, but the official records always read the 2nd year of his reign. How could that be the 2nd year of his reign? He's only been on the throne for 30 days. Simply because part of a year counts for the whole year. By the same token, part of a day counts for the whole day, all 24 hours of it, both the day and the night of it. So he was in the tomb part of Friday, which counts for all of Friday, then Saturday, and part of Sunday, which counts for all of Sunday. Only in this sense can all 3 statements be said to be true. He did rise on the 3rd day, because Friday was the 1st day, Saturday the 2nd, Sunday the 3rd. It's also true he only arose after 3 days, because part of a day counts for the whole day. He arose after 3 days as well. And the statement 3 days and 3 nights was a Jewish idiom simply meaning any period of time that touches 3 days. Yes, several examples of that in the Old Testament, such as the book of Esther, chapter 4, verse 10, to chapter 5, verse 1. Now in Esther 4:10, Esther says, "Fast for me 3 days and 3 nights, and I will then go see the king." The implication is, after 3 days and nights of fasting on the 4th day, she will go see the king. But Esther 5:1 says, on the 3rd day she went to see the king. In Gentile reckoning, there's simply no way of squeezing 3 24-hour periods out of that phrase. So again, if we take the statements as they read in this Jewish frame of reference, they're referring to a Friday crucifixion. Furthermore, the Jewish Talmud itself spells out the day that Jesus died. And here I quote, "There is a tradition. On the eve of the Sabbath and on Passover they hung Jesus. The heralds went out crying, 'Jesus goes forth to be executed because he practiced sorcery and seduced Israel and estranged them from their God. Let anyone who could bring forward a justifying plea for him come and give information concerning him.' But no justifying plea was found for him, and so they hung Jesus on the eve of the Sabbath and the Passover." In this rabbinic Talmudic quote, both in the beginning and the end, they both say the same thing. He died on the eve of the Sabbath, which is a Friday, and it happened to be a Passover day, which is affirmed by the Gospels. And so whether we deal with biblical literature and Jewish literature, the evidence is clear. He died on a Friday and rose again on the 1st day of the week. Which now brings us to the 5th and final main division of our study, the resurrection of the King. And the resurrection of Jesus will be the 3rd point of the Gospel. It's the 2nd sign of Jonah, but it's the 3rd point of the Gospel. The first point was that he died for our sins. Secondly, he was buried. Now thirdly, he rose again on the 3rd day. And since we talked about the theological implications of both his death and his burial, let's talk about the theological applications of his resurrection. Let me divide this into 3 categories: implications to him personally, implications concerning unbelievers, but implications about believers. First of all, the theological implications to Christ himself, two things. Number one, it proved him to be the Son of God, according to Romans 1:4. But secondly, it confirmed the truth of all that he said, according to Matthew 28, verse 6. Second category, the significance of his resurrection to all men. Also two things. Number one, it makes certain the resurrection of all, in 1 Corinthians 15, verses 20 to 22. But secondly, it guarantees the judgment of all in Acts 17, 30 and 31, because God will now judge all men on the basis of the resurrected Son. And then third category is the implications of the resurrection to believers. Number one, it proves our justification in Romans 4, 24 and 25. While we are justified by his death, his resurrection became the evidence of that justification. Secondly, guarantees power for service in Ephesians 1, 17 through 20. Thirdly, guarantees the believer's own personal resurrection in 2 Corinthians 4:14. Fourthly, it designates Christ as the head of the church in Ephesians 1, 20 to 22. Fifthly, it means that he now has the keys of death and Hades in Hebrews 2, verses 9 through 18. Let's move on now to our study about the resurrection, beginning with capital A on your notes, on your outline, the dawning of Resurrection Day, Mark 16:1 and Matthew 28, verse 1. Now Matthew verse 1 reads, "Now late on the Sabbath day, as it began to dawn towards the first day of the week." And because the way the English reads, it began to dawn, people have assumed it's talking about the wee hours of Sunday morning here. But in the original, the word dawn only refers to the beginnings of a brand new day. And keep in mind, in Jewish reckoning, the day begins at sundown, not at sunup. And so when it says late on the Sabbath day, it means very late on Saturday afternoon. As it began to dawn towards the first day of the week, it means moving towards the evening of Saturday. That would begin when 3 stars are visible, the first day of the week. On this occasion, Mary Magdalene and some other women came out and visited the sepulchre. So again, it shows that they clearly knew where the sepulchre was. Now, capital B, the opening of the tomb in Matthew 28, verses 2 through 4. Now, several things happen here. Number one, there was a great earthquake. And just as an earthquake marked the point of his death, a great earthquake also marks the point of his resurrection. At this instant, he is raised from the dead. Secondly, an angel of the Lord descended from heaven and came down and rolled the stone away. An angel comes down and rolls the stone away, and by rolling the stone away, this angel broke the Roman seal. And so the soldiers should have gone ahead and arrested the angel. But of course, you don't go around arresting angels, especially if in verse 3 his appearance was as lightning, his raiment was white as snow. So the third thing that happened is that in verse 4 they became as dead men. They were so frightened they could not move. They became as dead men. We have a figure of speech in English that describes the same thing, to be scared stiff. That's what happens here. They were literally scared stiff, so scared stiff they could either move towards the angel or to run away from the garden area. Now the next thing in your outline, capital C, we have the visit of the woman recorded in Matthew 28, 5 through 8, Mark 16, verses 2 through 8, Luke 24, 1 through 8, and John 20, verse 1. Several women now go out to a tomb, as now what we would call the wee hours of Sunday morning. They're coming for the purpose of completing the burial procedures. They come in two groups. The first group is a group of one, Mary Magdalene. And she arrives at the tomb, and all she sees is the stone rolled away, and the tomb is empty. She makes the incorrect assumption that the body had been moved, and she runs out of the tomb area with that presupposition to inform the apostles. After Mary Magdalene leaves, then other women come in, and they see more than what Mary Magdalene did. They see the stone rolled away and the tomb empty, but they also see the angels. And the angelic message to the woman is two things. Number one, Christ is risen, as he himself had said, and so there is no reason to seek the living among the dead, in Matthew verse 6 and Luke verse 5. Secondly, in Mark verse 7, they're told to go back and tell the apostles that he has been raised from the dead, and they are to immediately leave Jerusalem and head up for the Galilee, and he will meet with them in Galilee. And this is the second time they receive such instructions. During the last Passover, Jesus told them that he would be arrested that night, and when he's arrested, they are to leave immediately and head up for the Galilee. Because, as we noted, they never clearly understood the program of death and resurrection. When these things happened, it caught them by surprise, didn't know what to do, and so they never obeyed the first instruction and left for Galilee. Now, for the second time, they received these instructions to leave Jerusalem and head for the Galilee. At that point, three things happened. First, in Luke verse 8, they remembered his words, his prophecy, they would rise from the dead. Secondly, in Mark verse 8, they told no one outside the apostolic circle. But thirdly, in Matthew verse 8, they did run quickly to inform the apostles. That is the capital D on your outline, the report to the apostles. Now Mary, who left the tomb not seeing anything about angels and assuming the body had been removed, informs Peter and John about the empty tomb and what her suspicions are. This is John verse 2. We are now in John chapter 20 verses 2 through 10 and Luke 24 verses 9 through 12. The other women tell the other 9 apostles. And as Luke verse 11 points out, the other apostles disbelieved the woman's testimony. But in John's account, verse 3 through 10, as well as Luke's account, verse 12, John and Peter run to a tomb area in order to investigate. John outruns Peter. He stops at the opening of the tomb without going in. He stoops down and looks inside. And what he sees is that the grave clothes are still rolled up, with the headpiece separated from the body piece, again showing that whatever the shroud of Turin might be is not the shroud of Christ. But the fact that the grave clothes were still rolled up in its rolled up fashion, it shows that the resurrection took place right through the grave clothes. He didn't need to unwrap himself to move around, as was the case with Lazarus when he was resurrected. At this point, Peter catches up, always a bit more impetuous. He runs inside the tomb, and he sees the very same evidence that John just did. And when both men leave the tomb area, they leave with two different conclusions. John leaves the tomb area perfectly convinced that a resurrection had taken place. But Peter leaves the tomb area in a state of perplexity, not knowing what he should do with this evidence. That brings us to capital E on your outline, the first appearance, which is to Mary Magdalene. This is found in Mark's account, chapter 16, verses 9 through 11, and John chapter 20, verses 11 through 18. After Peter and John have left, Mary comes back by herself, still assuming the body had been moved, but this time she sees the angels, though they have taken on the form of young men, and so she does not recognize them for what they really are. In John verse 13, they ask her, "Woman, why are you weeping?" And when she speaks, she tells us exactly what she assumes to be true at this stage. "Because they have taken away my Lord, I know not where they have laid him." Again, she's assuming the body had simply been moved. At that point, Jesus appears, and she does not recognize him immediately. And in John's account, verse 15, she's asked the same question by him. "Why are you weeping? Who are you seeking?" And assuming he might be the gardener that moved the body, in John verse 15, "Sir, if you have moved him hence, tell me where you have laid him, and I will take him away." Finally, verse 16, he does call her by name in a way familiar to her, so at that point she recognizes him. And this sets the stage for the several resurrection appearances, in that he's not always recognized immediately by those who knew him, though eventually he is recognized. Because with the resurrection body, enough things change so that recognition is not immediate. Enough things remain the same so that after a while people who knew him recognize that he really is the one they knew. Now she recognized him by the way he called her by name, and we know the Galilean accent was quite a distinctive accent. And so we might retain our basic types of speech as well. Now those in the kingdom, you will be speaking only Hebrew, it'll only be one language, but we might be all speaking Hebrew with different languages that we came from in different countries or whatever. On the other hand, I like to say tongue-in-cheek that since the resurrection body is an immortal body, you'll all probably be speaking Hebrew with a Brooklyn accent, which is the ideal accent to have. Now, in verse 16, as she moves towards touching him, verse 17, he says to her, "Touch me not." And this has raised a bit of a quandary with some people. Why is she forbidden to touch him? Later that day, he will tell his apostles to touch him. There are two possible answers to this seeming contradiction. The first answer is to point out there are two different Greek words involved. The Greek word used for Mary means to cling, and the picture is she wants to cling to him so he can never go away, but go away he must. The other Greek word used of the apostles simply means to touch or to feel, but doesn't have the sense of clinging, and that's a very valid answer. There are two different Greek words which are used. I prefer the second answer because of the reason he gives her. Notice, the reason he gave her for not touching him is because I have not yet ascended to the Father. Earlier in our study, we talked about the Day of Atonement motif. Now, part of that motif was that on that day, the high priest took off his multicolored clothing and underwent the ritual immersion and put on his only yearly clothing he wore for this occasion, which was made of only a white color. And then he went through a whole procedure of sprinkling of the blood, and then he took off the white garments, underwent a second ritual immersion, and then went back to his multicolored clothing. Now, between the two immersions, he was untouchable. If anyone touched him after that first immersion, he would render the high priest unclean. He would not be able to proceed with the sprinkling of the blood in the Holy of Holies of the tabernacle or temple. Now, according to Hebrews chapter 9, verses 11, 12, and 24, and Hebrews 10, verse 12, at some point, Jesus had to go into heaven and to sprinkle his blood in the heavenly sanctuary. And I take it from what he says here, I have not yet ascended to the Father, and that at this point he had not yet taken his blood into heaven for the purpose of sprinkling the heavenly tabernacle. Because the writer of Hebrews says that while the earthly tabernacle could be cleansed with animal blood, the heavenly tabernacle needed the cleansing of better blood. It needed innocent human blood. And so he had to at some point bring his blood and do the job of Hebrews 9 and 10. And I take it from what he says to Mary, at this point he hadn't done so, and so he was untouchable. But after this short discussion with Mary, he ascended, sprinkled his blood, and so in the very next section, he was rendered already touchable. This also raises the question as to why did the heavenly tabernacle need cleansing of blood? And that's given to us in the book of Ezekiel, chapter 28, verses 11 through 19. The one of Satan's functions before his fall was to be the worship leader in heaven, the choir leader, so to speak. In fact, he was covered with those kinds of stones which were on the breastplate of the high priest. But when Satan fell, Ezekiel says he defiled his sanctuaries, plural, because there was the Holy of Holies in the holy place. And because Satan defiled the sanctuaries in heaven, it had to be cleansed with better blood, and it required his blood to do so. Another point I want to make here is to notice that the first appearance of the resurrected Christ is to a woman and not to a man. This is significant from his Jewish frame of reference because it argues against those who claim that this whole resurrection story was nothing but a fabrication made up by his followers. Now, if the resurrection was a fabrication, it would have been a Jewish fabrication because these are Jewish authors, Jewish writers. And this is not the way Jewish writers would have fabricated a story, because by Jewish law of that day, a woman could not serve as a valid witness. A woman cannot be a witness in a court of law, cannot be among the 2 or 3 witnesses to establish anything. And so, if they wanted to make the story believable, Jewish writers would have never made the witnesses women. They would have made them all men. But they had to report it this way because this is exactly the way it happened. So the very fact that the first appearance is to a woman and not to a man argues for its authenticity and not for it being a fabrication. However, as Mark verse 11 points out, the first reported sighting of the resurrected Christ is disbelieved. Let's go on to capital F on your outline, the second appearance to the other woman. Now the other women come and they also see Jesus, and it says in verse 9, they took hold of his feet and worshipped him. They're able to handle him. And so the fact they took hold of his feet, also a form of clinging by the way, it shows that between the first and second appearance he did ascend into heaven and nobody sprinkled his blood. And what he told Mary in the previous section in verse 17 of John, he now tells them here in Matthew 28, 9 and 10. He calls the disciples brothers or brethren. That is their new relationship as a result of his death and resurrection. And they are to report to the apostles and let the people know that he had been seen by them. And then for the third time, they are instructed to head for Galilee. These women are told to head for to tell disciples to go to Galilee. For the third time, they are told to leave Jerusalem and for Galilee. He will meet with them once they arrive in the Galilee. Because the second report is also disbelieved, the disciples do not leave Jerusalem. Now, capital G on your outline, we have the report of the guard in Matthew 28, verses 11 through 15. The Roman guard finally got their act together and ran away. In Roman laws of that day, if you failed in a simple mission like this, you'd be executed. And they were reluctant to go back to Pilate and to report a failed mission. It would mean their immediate execution. And they probably suspected that Pilate would be rather skeptical. They tried to tell him about this angel coming down and roll the stone away, so what could they do? So rather than going back to Pilate, which would be the norm, in verse 11 they go to the chief priest that had instigated this procedure to begin with and tell them what they had seen. And the chief priests, who are Sadducees, in verse 11 assemble with the elders who are Pharisees. So now we have a combined Pharisaic and Sadducean conspiracy. And they came up with the oldest theory of the empty tomb, the stolen body theory. And they paid the soldiers a large sum of money in verse 13. And in verse 14 and 15, they are to filter among the people of Jerusalem, informing them that while they were sleeping, disciples came and stole the body away. They also let them know that if the story gets back to the ears of Pilate, they will intervene so that these soldiers would not be executed. And since after Passover, Pilate returned to Caesarea anyway, he might never hear of this event taking place. And so here you have the oldest theory for the empty tomb, the stolen body theory. And they go around claiming that while they were sleeping, the disciples stole the body. Any thinking Jewish person would realize there is a discrepancy in the way they report it. Because what they're saying is, while we were sleeping, the disciples came and stole the body. But if they were sleeping, how would they know who stole the body? How would they know who it was if they were truly sleeping? Now, while this is the oldest theory for the empty tomb, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Let's look at this theory. Keeping in mind that anyone taking the body out will be punishable by death because he broke the Roman seal, only two groups would have a vested interest in risking their lives to break the seal, either his friends or his enemies. People in the neutral zone simply would not risk their lives to do a prank like this with soldiers right there. Now, if the enemy stole the body, keep in mind that these are the same enemies that later tried to silence the apostolic preaching of the cross. You could have done it once and for all by producing the body. The failure to produce the body shows they did not have it. The second group that will have a vested interest is his friends, his apostles, but that doesn't help to make sense of what happened in their later lives. Keep in mind that these apostles suffered tremendously in physical torture and death. 10 of these 11 would die deaths as martyrs. Some died horrendous deaths, like being crucified upside down like Peter was, like being boiled alive in oil, like being flayed alive. And what does that mean? Your body stretched out and they peeled the skin off you while you are still living. In virtually every case, they were given the option to renounce the preaching of the resurrection and die a more humane death or be set free. In every single case, they refused. It's a bit hard to believe that all 10 of these men would be willing to die such horrendous deaths for what they all knew was really a lie. Only way of explaining their actions after this event in the book of Acts and beyond is to note they really did believe a resurrection had taken place. Moving on to capital H, we have the third appearance of the two disciples on the Emmaus Road. These are two disciples outside the apostolic group. In Mark 16, 12, and 13, Luke 24, 13 through 32. Only one of these disciples is named in verse 18. That is a disciple called Cleopas. He may be named because of his later role in the history of the Church of Jerusalem. After the first pastor of that church was martyred, this one became the next one. And when the church had to leave the city in mass, for reasons we'll discuss when we finish this series, he was the leader that led the Church of Jerusalem out of the city, and because of his role is probably the reason why he alone happens to be named. As they're heading back to their hometown of Emmaus, they're discussing what had recently happened in reference to Jesus. And suddenly a third figure attaches himself to them, though he's not immediately recognized. And when he asked them, what are you talking about? And they relate to him, they spell out facts they believed, but also facts they had not believed. Up to now they have believed four things according to Luke's account, verses 19 through 21. Number one, they believed that Jesus was a prophet of God, and a prophet is one who receives direct revelation from God. Secondly, they believed that he authenticated his claims with his words and with his works. His works were evidence of his words or claims. Thirdly, that he was crucified by the leaders. And fourthly, that it was he that would be the Redeemer of Israel. Up to now they had believed he had to be the Messiah, though these recent events seem to militate against that belief. So far, these things they had believed. But in verse 22 and through 24, they spell out things they had not believed. And what they had disbelieved up until now is that certain women came and claimed to have seen him resurrected, but none of the men saw him resurrected, and therefore it appeared to the men as being nothing but idle words. And in verse 21, notice what they say. Yet besides all this, it is now the third day. Now keep in mind, it's Sunday afternoon. And they mention his trial, his death, and reported resurrections, and it's all still only the third day. And again, this is only possible if the crucifixion took place on a Friday. If it took place Tuesday, Wednesday, or Thursday, there's no possible way that Sunday afternoon can still be the third day. At that point, in verse 25 and 26, Jesus scolds them for their unbelief. And in verse 27, he begins to give them a lesson in messianic prophecy, meaning prophecies about the first coming, beginning from Moses and going through all the prophets, showing the very things that seem to them to militate against his messiahship now become evidences for it. And when he arrived at Emmaus, he's invited to sup with them, and he, according to verse 30 and 31, says the blessing over the bread. Normally, the host has the blessing over the bread, but by Jewish tradition, if your guest is a Bible scholar, he says the blessing over the bread. And because of his exposition about Messianic prophecy, they recognized him to be the Bible scholar, and he says the blessing over the bread. At that instant, as he says the blessing in verse 31, their eyes were opened. They recognize who he is. In that same instantaneous second, he disappears from their sight. And so what they now do is go right back to Jerusalem and tell the apostolic group they had seen the resurrected Christ. But as Mark verse 12 and 13 point out, this third report has also been disbelieved. Looking at one more for today, the fourth appearance in capital I on your notes is to Peter in Luke 24, 33 to 35 and 1 Corinthians 15, 5. And here we have the first one of the apostolic group to see the resurrected Christ, Simon Peter. This was necessary probably to comfort him because of his earlier 3 times denying Jesus, to reestablish him in the faith. And because he's the first apostle to see the resurrected Christ, it sets the stage for him becoming the chief of the apostles, his role in the book of Acts. We have to stop here, so we shall continue our study in the resurrection on our next session.